Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. What's up, guys? McJibbin here, back with another reaction video. Guys, go get on the Discord, all right? A lot easier for me to talk with you guys and see video recommendations. For instance, this one we're doing right now is I've been asking kind of, what could Germany have done differently in World War II to not, if maybe not win it, but at least prolong their defeat. And I thought maybe focusing rather than going in and adding this other giant enemy like Russia, you get resources otherwise. A lot of people's explanations for why Hitler and Germany were so eager to take on Russia was to get more resources for their war machine, which makes complete sense. But why not focus more on just shoving your forces through the Mediterranean and northern Africa in a way to try and not immediately provoke Russia? And a lot of great answers on that, and this was suggested by the marshals over there, and we are getting right into it, all right? Original video, the top description below. This is my first video of the day, so sorry if I'm a bit groggy and not completely with it, but I will continue to wake up as I drink my coffee. So let's get right into it. I am eager to see what the explanation is for this. Let's do it. Make sure everything is right. Good. Oh, Woody. This is Woody. He's my little guest for the day, or at least for this video. Let's do it.
If Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, he would likely have never got another chance. People keep saying that the Germans should have produced more panzers, they should have produced more planes, or produced more submarines. People can't understand why Hitler allows the British to withdraw from Dunkirk, or why his generals call him mad for
I understand a lot of things are in hindsight.
ordering his men to stand fast and fight to the death when he has so little manpower, even though these are actually strategically sound decisions given the circumstances. Why did Germany have to invade the Soviet Union in 1941? Why was their army marching on foot instead of riding in trucks? Why are they reliant on horses? It's all related to the same question. Why did Germany and the Axis powers lose World War II? And it can all be summed up with just one word.
Oil.
Oil. Let's find out why. Few people seem to realise just how severe the oil crisis was for the Axis in World War II. World War II has been described by one academic historian as the first war for oil. When you study World War II, you should have the oil crisis in the back of your mind, because that is how important it is. And we'll find out exactly why in this video. Oil is not the only factor, but oil is the most important one, and it's what dooms the Axis to defeat in World War II. That's not to say they didn't have a chance of victory, but oil is a massive problem for Germany, who's relying on Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, to win its wars. It's also the reason that after the war, Britain is no longer a superpower, and the Soviet Union and the United States are, although that's a topic for another day. Below you'll find a pinned comment with timestamps of parts of the video, so if you want to skip ahead you can do that, but I wouldn't recommend skipping ahead in this case because you'll miss the context. But you'll also find sources,
We're in the whole thing, baby.
sources that I use down there as well. You'll miss the context, but you'll also find the sources that I use down there as well. Anyway, let's just start from the beginning. The 19th century was the age of coal. Britain was the leading coal-producing country in the world, thanks to Welsh miners. It powered its ships with coal and thus dominated the waves. In fact, this was the reason that it had such a big merchant fleet. It was the only nation really able to power it thanks to coal. But in the early 1900s, it became obvious that oil was the emergent dominant energy source, since oil would power ships more effectively and would be able to power planes, cars, trucks, and eventually tanks, as well as industry as a whole. Coal could not power tanks, nor could it compete with oil. Therefore, on a strategic level, whoever controlled the oil controlled the world. And at this stage, the only real oil producer was the United States of America. Venezuela and the Soviet Union, plus a few other minor countries, are producing some oil, but the United States was producing nearly 70% of the world's crude oil at this stage. Britain, Germany,
Rockefeller. Shout out to Rockefeller.
France, Italy, the old European powers do not produce oil. They became dependent on the USA and Venezuela, plus others, for oil, meaning that they now have to make sure they're on good terms with them in order to not pay over the top prices.
I wonder why it is that Venezuela has so many oil reserves. That's less of a history question and I guess more of a geology question.
For oil, but also would have to secure access to them in order to not pay over the top prices for oil, but also would have to secure access to them in the event of war. If they failed to do that, they would run out of oil very quickly. This is why the Weimar Republic sets about growing synthetic oil production, since Germany has little to no domestic oil production of its own. Synthetic oil production is essentially a process whereby coal is converted into oil. And that's how desperate they were for oil. They were willing to use coal itself in great demand, and Germany was also short of that as well. The problem
Right, that shows how great oil is, I guess.
was that this was an expensive process, very expensive,
Or useful.
but it was also a limited process. However, the cost was deemed to be essential on a strategic level in order for Germany to become economically independent from the oil powers. For Hitler, autarky, economic independence and self-sufficiency was the goal if Germany was to wage war, and oil was probably the biggest limiting factor that he faced. It took time to grow the domestic synthetic oil industry, and this was nowhere near prepared to meet the demands of Germany's oil consumption when Hitler's National Socialists took power in 1933. Germany was reliant on imports, and the oil producers during the 1930s were essentially the United States.
Sorry if there's a noise here.
Venezuela, and the oil producers during the 1930s were essentially the United States, Venezuela, and the Soviet Union, the nations that Hitler would wage war against or would not be able to trade with when war broke out. Even the Middle East, specifically Iran and Iraq, were not producing much oil at this stage, and what little they did produce could not be easily moved to Europe.
One of the big kind of reasons I had going in here is kind of hurt by what he just said. Of course, we think of the Middle East today with all the oil, but a bit naive of me to therefore believe that they were known to have all of these places, not just known to have these reserves, but the infrastructure to take the oil out. So that is one, the first kind of blow to my theory.
Europe, as the British were finding out to their cost. Produce could not be easily moved to Europe, as the British were finding out to their cost. This meant that both the British and the Germans were reliant on the USA and Venezuela for oil. In Europe, Romania is the largest exporter of crude oil, but even combined with German output, as well as the rest of the European output, like Hungary, this is simply not enough to meet European demand. In fact, Romanian oil production had sunk from 8.7 million tonnes in 1930.
That is just the story of Europe right there, right?
Romanian oil production had sunk from 8.7 million tonnes demand. In fact, this is simply not enough to meet European demand.
Right there.
Output, like Hungary.
Right here.
This is simply not enough to meet European demand.
Insert any good. Any trade good there, and that pretty much sums it up.
In fact, Romanian oil production had sunk from 8.7 million tonnes in 1936 to 5.2 million tonnes in 1941, partly due to political reasons. So Romania isn't really a reliable source of oil, and in 1939 Germany still imported 60% of its petroleum requirements, and that's during peacetime. So what happens when the Germans go to war? The quick victories in 1939 and 1940 produce a massive energy crisis in Germany. When the French surrender, Britain decides to keep fighting. This means that imports from outside of Europe cease thanks to the British blockade. Germany's domestic oil production, synthetic or otherwise, now suddenly has to meet the demand.
That means capturing or destroying any transfer of oil is crucial.
Of not only Germany itself, but all the countries it's just conquered. This was really bad news. Germany and a sphere of influence consumed 9,558,000 tons more oil than it produced. And this was in 1940. Britain, wooed to the last moment, had declared war on him, placing him in a position of strategic and economic dependence on the state whose annihilation was the central objective, the Soviet Union. Drastic measures were introduced in May of 1941 to curb oil consumption, and these were ordered by Hitler himself. These were so severe that in 1941, Economics Minister Walter Funk said that the economy was receiving less than 18% of its peacetime oil quantities. But it isn't enough, and even more cuts to the civilian economy followed. These cuts were so extensive that British Air Ministry observers secretly referred to them in early 1942 as the severest form of rationing. But it still isn't enough, and the German economy followed. These cuts were so extensive that British Air Ministry observers secretly referred to them in early 1942 as the severest form of rationing. But it still isn't enough, and the German army is affected. In February of 1941, Goering is warned by General de Infantry Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, that fuel reserves would only last about 2 months during operational consumption, i.e. during an offensive. On the 8th of March 1941, Keitel was also warned by Georg Thomas that existing supplies of petroleum would run out in the middle of August or in the autumn. In March of 1941, General Erdhard Wagner, the Army Quartermaster General, gave an equally gloomy prognosis to Halder, informing him that once Germany lost its imports from the Soviet Union, existing stocks were only sufficient for 2 months of large-scale offensive consumption. Rommel has one eye on the petrol gauge at all times because the Italian fleet hasn't got enough oil to ship more oil across to him. In fact, the Italian fleet is sat in harbour throughout the war through lack of oil. In May 1941, Georg Thomas again says Germany will run out of oil in...
I should have expected this or known this. I didn't realize just... Sounds so just stupid, but just really this video puts into perspective just how important resources are in general and how they are often overlooked, but oil specifically.
In late October 1941. In late May 1941, General Adolf von Schell, the man responsible for the motor vehicle industry, seriously suggested that in light of the chronic shortage of oil, it would be advisable to carry out a partial demotorization of the Wehrmacht. At this stage, the German army has 10 motorized and 20 panzer divisions at this stage, out of 151 divisions aimed at the Soviet Union. Yet here was the leading general of the motor industry seriously suggesting that they reduce this number even further. As a result of the fuel crisis, the Wehrmacht was forced to rely extensively on horse-drawn transport, which led to further problems. The tremendous difficulties in the pace of march between the motorized and other units raised the issue of when and how to close pockets. Horse-drawn columns were vulnerable to attacks that aggravated logistic problems, and the lack of fodder and replacement animals put a strain on civilian supplies. If they do nothing, the Germans and the Axis powers in Europe will lose their ability to strike.
Already, I've been taught something major. And I don't want to say it pretty much just crumbled my whole idea. It's just, I'm very much less like, whoa, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do this? And much more like, okay, they're not stupid. These people in charge of war offensive and stuff, they're not dumb, and it just really makes you forces you to view the war through an additional angle. So
they either have to find peace with Britain or find oil elsewhere. There is an attempt to get more oil from Romania in the March of 1941 when Goering meets with Romanian dictator Antonescu in Vienna to discuss the raising of oil production in Romania. Goering also forms the Continental Oil AG in 1940 and 41, which was essentially a Central European fuel company that aims to get as much oil as possible. It secured the Romanian oil fields for Germany by buying out Belgian and French-owned oil companies in Romania, controlling 23% of the oil production in Romania by the spring of 1942. But Romanian oil could only really go so far, and peace with Britain...
One second.
now seen Romania 3% of the oil production in Romania by the spring of 1942. But Romanian oil could only really go so far, and peace with Britain now seemed remote. What option was left for Germany in late 1940 and 41? They could take the Middle East, but again, the oil industry there is in its infancy, and
that's my major blunder in this discussion. Of course, I didn't expect myself not to catch blunders here, but a main answer to one of my big questions is, of course, the infrastructure to take the oil out of the Middle East could not have met the demand for Germany anyway, and so perhaps going to the Caucasus, taking over Russian oil was the only option, and so it's not as dumb of an idea as I thought. Very insightful video
British
so far.
Are not extracting much oil from it themselves.
What is even better is that this is only 11 minutes in, and it's already explained much of what I was confused about, so I can't wait to see what else it has to say.
Plus, how would the Germans get that oil back to Germany to be refined? It's just not practical. So, unless he wants to watch his war machine and economy collapse, there's really only one viable option to Mr. Hitler at this stage. The occupied territories would drain Germany's meagre petroleum reserves within a year unless the Third Reich took immediate action to expand its supplies by invading the Soviet Union. On the 31st of July 1940, Hitler decides that the attack on the Soviet Union is going to happen. Some have said that Germany should have done one of several other options, like smashing the British in the Middle East or concentrating on the U-boat war. But it's clear, at least in Hitler's mind, that there's a time limit going on. At the Berghof on the 9th of January 1941, Hitler says that smashing the Soviet Union would represent a great relief to Germany and to Japan. After Russia's destruction, Germany would be unassailable. Russia's expanses contained immeasurable wealth. Germany must dominate them economically and politically, but not annex them. Thus, she would have all the potential for waging war, even against continents in the future.
So pretty much conquering someplace, not necessarily to administer it, but to form a puppet state and then take all of the goods, all of the goodies, the oil resources.
He needs Soviet oil, and his eyes are on the Caucasus. It is crucial to see...
Great job, by the way. All you guys, Melkor, Emperor of Rome, Let X7, you got this is a really great video.
Quickly and exploit the Caucasus oil fields, at least the areas around Maykop and Grozny. In oil fields that have not yet been completely destroyed, it will take about a month to resume production and another month for its transport. We will have to seize those areas no later than the end of the operation's second month. If this proved unsuccessful, we must expect the most serious repercussions with unpredictable consequences for military operations after the 1st of September 1941 and for the survival of the economy. The 1st of September 1941. This is the date.
It's almost my birthday.
That Germany has to win by. If it doesn't win by early September, the Germans will suffer. big time. Why does Hitler invade the Soviet Union when he does? Because June 1941 is the latest the Germans can actually invade. Why not earlier? Rainy season, Balkans, Russian winter in 1940-41, just to name a few issues. But there is an argument to say, well, he could have invaded a few weeks earlier, and that's fine. But the point is that the summer of 1941 is the last time Germany has the option to invade because of the oil crisis. Britain's decision to keep on fighting in 1940 forces this on Germany. The blockade prevents German imports of oil, starving the
So that's the big thing, is that there weren't other alternatives. You had Venezuela. You're not going to go over there without serious. All right, go to Venezuela, maybe make it across, you'll make it across the Atlantic, start doing it, but you're going to have such very prone to attacks. And by the time you get enough across, it might be too late. Africa, there isn't the oil infrastructure, or Northern Africa, Middle East, isn't the oil infrastructure to get all of that oil. America, obviously, you're not just going to get it from them, Russia, and so this is the only option, really clearing up a lot.
Axis of the means to fight. This is what imports of oil, starving the axis of the means to fight. This is what triggers Germany to invade the Soviet Union and sets a time limit to that invasion. And either way, Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941 with the goal of keeping this to a short war. It has to be short because they only have enough oil to fight it for a few months. The oil crisis dictates that Germany must win and take the Caucasus in 2 months, otherwise their army will be rendered ineffective. They must either knock out the Soviets completely, force their collapse or surrender, or crush the Red Army and then take the oil before the Soviets have time to recover. This is why going to Moscow in 1941 is wrong. This is why taking on Leningrad is kind of irrelevant. This is why Guderian is turned south.
True. Now my kind of idea is, why not just go force your way right to there, take control, and then focus on Moscow and what you need
to help Army Group South, which does in fact go into the Caucasus briefly in 1941 and is forced back. It's because Germany needs to get to the oil. The reason Barbarossa is designed to be a short, sharp campaign to wipe the Soviets out at the border, one is forced back. It's because Germany needs to get to the oil. The reason Barbarossa is designed to be a short, sharp campaign to wipe the Soviets out at the border and then ride off into victory is because of the oil shortage. It's not because of the limited manpower. It's not because they can't replace tanks. They actually can replace tank numbers, as shown in the previous video. The Germans have more tanks in 1942 than in 1941 and more tanks in 1943 than in 1942. The problem is that they can't run the tanks they already have beyond the autumn of 1941. Barbarossa is designed to crush the Red Army, then win. And there's no backup plan if this doesn't happen because it's do or die time. There's little to no mention about Soviet reserves because the Germans are hoping that they don't have any. If they do have reserves, they're not going to get the resources needed to fight them. It's interesting because according to Starhill, the first plans of Operation Barbarossa do not even factor in Soviet reserves at all. Paulus is the first to say, actually, the Soviets will probably have another 100 divisions behind the frontier troops. People say Paulus was a passive commander or bad commander, and I'll come back to that at a later date. But for Barbarossa, he was on the ball. Unfortunately, for the Germans and for Paulus, it wasn't 100 reserve divisions, it was more like 300, although many were not anywhere near their full strength. But the Germans don't really have much choice. If they don't win in 2 months, their army won't be able to win because their main weapon, their panzers, won't have enough fuel to win. So it has to be a short, sharp campaign, and it has to be waged in 1941. Overy states that in 1941, Hitler made the mistake of invading the Soviet Union in the belief that the tactics of lightning war would bring about victory in 4 months.
Problem with lightning war in Russia is just the vast distances make it much more complicated now.
Why 4 months? They started on the 22nd of June, so July, August, September, October when they run out of oil. It wasn't the invasion of the Soviet Union that was the problem, it was the fact that they hoped to win the war in just 4 months. If you read Guderian, you will know that Hitler's decision to turn south during Barbarossa cost the Germans the time needed to take Moscow. This was often seen as a mistake. No, it wasn't. If Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us, but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. Germany would gain accommodation, but that alone will not win the war.
I found that interesting with Russia. It's not the conventional it's not the kind of ordinary country where you take the capital, you take the country. Not with Russia, no.
The only thing that matters is oil. As we remember, Germany kept harping on about her own urgent oil problems in her economic bargaining with us from 1939 to 1941. So we have to do all we can, A, to make Germany increase her oil consumption, and B, to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus. That's a speech by Timoshenko in November of 1941. The Soviets will not surrender if Moscow falls, just like Russia did not surrender in 1812 against Napoleon. Hitler deemed Moscow to be, quote, not very important, and actually wanted to concentrate forces to the south. Halder did not want to do that, and subsequently the High Command did not do that, favouring the Moscow axis. Striking south makes more sense, and not just for the oil. Since the British blockade precluded the importation of additional foodstuffs from outside Europe, Germany faced the bitter prospect, as in 1917-18, of food shortages, hunger and political upheaval. Worryingly, Belgian miners had already gone on strike in the winter of 1940-41 to protest the meagre food supplies, while on the 1st of May 1941, German civilians had to face a drastic reduction in their own rations. The Ukraine was a central target, as well as the Caucasus, which was also a fertile food production area. On the strategic level, most of the goals were in the south, the Ukraine and the Caucasus. It makes little sense then that Halder and his staff decide to concentrate in the north and centre. The German military leadership, in fact, displayed a woeful lack of understanding of economic factors by training and tradition focused almost exclusively on the operational tactical aspects of planning. The OKH designed a plan.
So what was their reasoning behind focusing so much on the north? I guess they're
based on the lessons of the 1940 French campaign that emphasised a swift, decisive concentric thrust towards the enemy capital, unconcerned by the fact that the economically vital regions lay in the south. It's worth noting that after World War II, Halder is the advisor at the US Army Historical Division and is the central figure influencing the post-war German narrative of the war. He's the guy the other generals are going to, and he is the one who is coming up with the narrative that says Hitler was the cause of all of Germany's blames and mistakes during the war. Halder and his generals are not going to admit their own mistakes, and when you read the early World War II histories, the ones most people are familiar with because that is the post-war narrative, they show that Moscow was the correct route and Halder was right and Hitler was wrong. Reluctantly, Hitler gave in to the urging of Brauchitsch, Halder and Bock and consented to the resumption of the drive on Moscow, but too late. This quote comes after a few pages of constantly going on about how Hitler made the...
You can't just go after the war and want you to be right and just expect not to have to explain yourself. It's like, no, Hitler was wrong. He's dead. Obviously, they lost the war. We went in the north. That was the right call. You can't just expect that not to go without questions.
Quote comes after a few pages of constantly going on about how Hitler made the wrong decision to turn south and how Halder was so right. This is why Guderian is saying how bad the decision to turn from Moscow and help Army Group South was. Hitler said that the raw materials and agriculture of the Ukraine were vitally necessary for the future prosecution of the war. He spoke once again of the need of neutralizing the Crimea, that Soviet aircraft carrier, for attacking the Romanian oil fields. For the first time, I heard him use the phrase, "My generals know nothing about the economic aspects of war." Hitler's words all led up to this. He had given strict orders that the attack on Kiev was to be the immediate strategic objective, and all actions were to be carried out with that in mind. I here saw for the first time a spectacle with which was later to become very familiar. All those present nodded in agreement with every sentence that Hitler uttered, while I was left alone with my point of view. But Guderian is wrong, and is alone in his point of view because, as Hitler says, he doesn't understand the strategic and economic aspects of the war. And the best part is, Halder is actually awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1961 for helping the US military in their historical research. So yeah, Halder and his cronies paint a completely biased picture of the war, blame Hitler for bad decisions even though they weren't, show themselves in as good a light as possible even though they in fact made the bad decisions, and then gets awarded for doing so. But apparently when you try and point this out to people, you get branded a revisionist. No, the German sources are biased, just like the Soviet sources, and they are twisting the facts to manipulate the way you perceive the war. And just to point out, there's no such thing as a revisionist historian. Historian, by definition, looks at the sources and questions them. If they don't do that, well, you're not a historian. Anyway, so Halder and the German general's narrative of the war is...
I like that a lot. Keep your emotions out of history. I might be contradicting myself in a few areas, my joke, but in all seriousness, history isn't textbooks. It's not words in textbooks. It's not conversations. It's not debates. It is simply what happened in the past. That's what history is. What happened in the past. And so it will never be true. History will never be truly known. But that doesn't mean you just get to fill it in with what you would like it to be.
Biased towards the Moscow axis and is painting Hitler as a madman. No, going towards Moscow is a terrible decision. So tight were fuel rations that in November 1941, Opel was forced to shut down production at its Brandenburg plant, Germany's largest truck factory, because it lacked the petrol necessary to check the fuel pumps and of vehicles coming off the assembly line. A special allocation of 104 cubic meters of fuel had to be arranged by the Wehrmacht's economic office so as to ensure that there was no further interruptions. The German economy is on its last legs. The German Wehrmacht is critically short of fuel despite having absolute priority. It runs out of fuel in October and November 1941. The Germans, in fact, reach the Caucasus and take Rostov in 1941, but are thrown back during the Soviet winter counteroffensive. Interestingly, the terrible German logistics actually plays into their favour, as Hayward points out, because the backlog of fuel trains ends up clearing in December, and fuel therefore does get to the front, which allows the German army to fight on through the winter months. But essentially, from this point on, the Germans are now not able to wage the war that they had before. They can no longer advance on a broad front like they did during 1941. They would only have enough fuel to supply one German army group. This is why Moscow isn't taken in 1942. Instead, Hitler sends his panzers south. This is his last chance to find oil.
That's a good place to, I think, stop. I'm going to split this into two videos. It's an amazing video. I'm going to finish the rest of it. But I just want to make sure that I don't make the mistake again of straying too far into these long videos all at once and burning me out in the day, and so that I don't get to the, the Caesar and the history of Russia series, which are kind of my main focus right now. So I am going to continue this either later today or then definitely tomorrow. Very insightful, and I'm still very eager to see, after I've learned this much, what happens to the rest of the video. Stay tuned, guys. I'm getting out with another video soon. Go join the Discord. See you guys next time.